Hello and welcome to You Sew You. My name's Zoe and this is my channel all about the crafty bits and pieces I get up to. I knit and I sew, I weave, I dabble in all sorts of bits and pieces, whatever takes my fancy really. And this is my series about how I've made the Queen's Gambit dress. So welcome to any returning viewers, and to any new viewers a very warm welcome to you. This is the first of a series of short videos going through the process that I'm taking to make the Queen's Gambit dress. So this dress that's been all over the internet, doesn't Anya Taylor-Joy look fantastic in it? I've had a look at the construction as best as I can from the pictures. I've drafted my own pattern and I'm going to be sewing that up, and I'm going to walk you through the steps that I'm taking as we go. So today we're going to talk about the dress and the construction, we're going to look at the fabric, and we're going to draft out the bodice pieces for my version of this dress. To make sure that you get notified when the next video goes up and you can follow the process along, do make sure that you like and subscribe and ding the bell down below. You know, all the things the YouTubers ask you to do. Do that. And yeah, let's get into it. So let's start with fabric. Now, it couldn't be anything other than this fabric that I've been sent by Minerva.com. There will be a post going up on that site once the dress is complete, with pictures and a write-up of it, sort of summarising the things that are in this video, because Minerva has sent me this fabric in return for a blog post. So that's what I'll be doing. So obviously keep an eye out for that post when it goes live. I'm obviously going to have to be very careful with pattern matching. I mean, it's a large check tartan. It's green and navy with these bold white lines and red lines. So I am going to have to be very careful to make sure that where I can match up the pattern, I do. But I mean, how close is this to the fabric of the original dress from the series that you see in the picture here? So yeah, it really couldn't have been anything else. So I've got this fabric for my main fabric. I also have from Minerva some bottle green lining fabric. I'm certainly going to be lining the bodice, because it's easier than drafting facings, but also I like the finish with a lined bodice, so I'll be doing that, and if I have enough I'll be fully lining the skirt as well, but I'm not 100% certain that this is going to be wide enough to line a circle skirt, so we'll see how we go. So that's the fabric. Now if we think about the construction of the dress itself, you can actually see, if you look at the picture closely, not necessarily in this video because it's quite small on the screen, but if you look at the images when you Google them, there are princess seams going from the shoulder down the bodice to the waist. So I'm trying to replicate that. There's also this mock crossover front to the dress. I don't know why I'm pointing, because my hand is going to be covered up by the picture when it goes on screen, but there we go. So I'm actually using the Deer & Doe Sirocco jumpsuit top as a basis for my bodice drafting. Yes, you can absolutely draft the bodice from scratch, but if you've got a bodice that you know fits you well, why not use that to help you? Now, the Sirocco is a stretch pattern. The fabric that I'm using is not stretch. So there are some considerations to bear in mind when you're using stretch patterns for non-stretch fabrics, mostly the ease. Now the Sirocco actually has 2 inches of positive ease in the pattern, and I'm going to be using a side zip because I can't imagine how else this dress was closed other than with a side zip. So I have an invisible zip to insert through the bodice into the top of the skirt. So I'm not too concerned about using the Deer & Doe pattern as the basis for my bodice pattern. So without further ado, let's have a little look at how I've drafted that particular pattern for the Queen's Gambit dress. A word of caution, I am not an expert pattern drafter. I only occasionally do it. I haven't drafted princess seams from scratch, so you will notice as you watch the footage of me drafting out the bodice that I did have to have a little think as I was going in order to make sure that the princess seam was going to work how it's meant to do. It basically replaces a dart, and that's the crucial thing to remember when you're drafting princess seams. They are replacements for darts and pleats and that kind of thing, so they take fabric away. But more on that as we watch the footage.
Okay, so as I said, I'm using the Sirocco bodice, deer and doe pattern, as the basis for my bodice for the Queen's Gambit dress, so as a block if you will. Which means the first step is going to be to trace around the outside of the pattern piece that I've already got cut out. Now I'm using a purple highlighter to do this, partly because it'll show up better on screen, but I do also use highlighters to trace out quite often, either because I'm tracing out a commercial pattern that's tracing on like the flimsy pattern paper on the carpet and don't want the pencil to go through the paper, or because I'm tracing around something that's already been cut, as is the case here. I'm also using gridded pattern paper for reference, as I know that I'm going to need to make some measured adjustments on the front and back bodice pieces. So the grid will help me to make sure there's equal on both. So now that I've got my basic block traced out, I can make some adjustments to the fit. So on the sirocco pattern, there's a neckband that goes around the front of the bodice and brings in that neckline to closer to where I'd be looking for it to be on the Queen's Gambit dress. So I'm just marking that in on this pattern piece. I'm extending the front. I will probably need to make an adjustment at the neck end to this line when I sew it together, because I'm not going to be adding on the same width to the neck on the back piece, because that will sit in a place where I'm fairly happy for it to be, given that it's a pinafore that's going to be worn over other things. I don't need to worry about too much modesty, but it does mean that the shoulder seams are not going to be quite the same length on both my pattern pieces, but I'll be adjusting that on the fly when I come to sew it together. So I'm also dropping the waist seam on these bodice pieces. The reason being, on the sirocco there's a waistband and I'm not using a waistband on the Queen's Gambit, so I'm just lowering that seam in lieu of a waistband to meet where the waistline of the skirt is going to sit. And then we can just tidy up the edges of the pattern piece and start thinking about how to turn it from the sirocco pattern into the Queen's Gambit pattern. There are some things I'm going to do on the pattern, there are some things that I'll do when I'm working with fabric. For instance, checking the shoulder seam width and the arm side, given that there's going to be no sleeves on the dress. That I'll do once I've got it in fabric form. Now, my initial thought was to use the Lulu pattern as the basis for my princess seams. So the Lulu cardigan is another pattern that I know fits me really well, and it does have princess seams. So I'm just attempting to place the centre front piece onto the sirocco pattern and work out where to put it, which is a little trickier than it sounds, because I'm trying to match up against the pleat marks and the neckline, but there's like saddle shoulders on the Lulu, which is why it's ended up being lower than the shoulder seam. Now, as you can see, the princess seam on the Lulu goes into the arm side, and that's not what I was looking for with the Queen's Gambit. I really wanted it to go into the shoulder seam, so I picked up my French curve and I'm just going to move that princess seam to the other side of the pleat. So there's two pleat marks on the sirocco for either side of the pleat. So I'm using the French curve to sort of eyeball where I want it to be, around about those pleat points, but so that the seam finishes in the middle of the shoulder and curves over the fullest part of the bust. Now, I happen to know that the fullest part of my bust is in line with my armpit, so the bottom of the arm side. So I'm just giving myself a visual reference on the pattern as to where that is to give me a bit of guidance as I'm putting in that seam line. Okay, so there's my princess seam for the front bodice inserted, curving over the fullest part of the bust. And I don't need the one that goes into the arm side anymore. Obviously, when I label up the pattern pieces, I'm going to be really careful to make sure that I am indicating seam allowances, because there's going to be no written instructions to go with this pattern. It's just going to be the pattern pieces themselves. So if I'm going to make it again in a different fabric, I'll need to know that the princess seams have no seam allowance included on the paper, whereas the other seams have 5/8 of an inch included. I could obviously retrace the pattern pieces and add the seam allowance to the princess seams, but I'll probably just add them on when I cut out the fabric to save paper. Hope you're enjoying the new 60s themed music. Thought it might be appropriate for the Queen's Gambit videos. And obviously I'm making sure to label which pattern piece is which as well. I'm using QG to denote Queen's Gambit, and then marking whether it's centre front, side front, centre back, side back, that kind of thing. Again, so that when I come back to the pattern pieces in the future, I know exactly what I'm doing with them. So when I come to cut out these pattern pieces, before I go near the fabric, I will be checking the princess seam works. So I'll cut from the waistline up to the fullest part of the bust, and essentially just curve the paper around and hold it up against myself to make sure that curve is sitting in the right place. I'll do that before I go anywhere near the fabric, in case I need to make any adjustments at that point. So the line across the princess seam is going to help me to match up the pieces, particularly the one that's higher up. The reason for that one being more important will become clear later. But it's effectively a notch mark. So that'll be where I line up the centre front and the side front. And I'll do the same on the back pieces. It's going to be very much the same process to draft out the back bodice piece. Start with the bodice piece from the sirocco. For the sake of clarity and the video, I'm just going to make sure that I'm keeping it the same orientation as the front bodice piece, but obviously draft it out in the way that's going to make the best use of paper for you. So once again, I'm going to trace around the bodice piece first to give me that block to work from. Now the back piece is going to be cut on the fold. As I say, I'm not going to be making an adjustment at the neckline like I did for the front, so I will probably need to do a bit of adjustments on the fly once I'm working with the fabric to keep those shoulder seams neat. but since it's a sleeveless pinafore, I will probably need to narrow the shoulder anyway, so I'm not too concerned about doing that. So again, I'm marking on my pleat point so I know where to put the princess seam, and I'm going to lengthen the bottom of the back bodice by counting the squares between the original seam line and the new seam line on the front bodice and replicating that on the back. Turns out it was about 5 squares. Again, I'm using my French curve to position the princess seam. I'm not worrying too much about whether the princess seams will meet at the shoulders, partly because I am aware that I may need to make some adjustments to the length of that shoulder seam anyway, but also because of the fabric that I am using. A slight mismatch at the shoulder seam there is not going to notice too much. Making sure that the red and white lines match horizontally and that they run vertically is going to be more significant to the overall look of the finished garment. So the centre back piece now has its princess seam line marked in. That's going to be cut on the fold, whereas the side pieces and the front pieces I'll need to cut 2 of each. Again, I'm labelling everything up carefully, making sure any instructions that I need are on the pattern pieces, because I won't be having a separate written set of instructions to go with it. Marking on the seam allowances, the 5/8 of an inch where it's included, and making sure that I mark on the princess seam that the seam allowance is not included. If I wanted to, I could use these pattern pieces to draft a facing for the neckline and for the armholes, but I've opted not to. I'm going to use lining up to the seam line instead, and I'll understitch to keep that rolled inside the finished garment. But more on that in the next video when I actually sew the bodice together. So that's pretty much everything on the pattern now, apart from one thing. I've marked the princess seam on the centre pieces, but if you remember, I was saying that the princess seams effectively replace darts and pleats. So this is where the reason for the top line across the princess seam being significant for matching things up, and the second pleat point mark comes into play. I'm going to need to take out some fabric between the 2 pleat points up to pretty much where the fullest part of the bodice is. So I'll be using my French curve to do that. And then, as I say, when I cut out the paper, before I go anywhere near the fabric, I'll cut up to where those 2 lines join and just curve it around and make sure that fit works before I start cutting things out of fabric. So on the front piece, I'm using my bust reference mark on the paper to help me find that point where the lines should join. And there we go, that's my pattern pieces drafted out for my Queen's Gambit bodice.
was useful for you. And obviously the next stage is cutting out the fabric and sewing up the bodice. So if you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe and ding the bell down below so that you're notified when that next video goes live. It should be within the week, and obviously if you're watching this in the future, it'll be in the playlist with this video. So until next time, happy crafting, and I will see you soon. But bye-bye for now.